Good afternoon and welcome to the next webinar in our series of hazardous waste regulation updates, specifically focusing on the printing sector. Today's topic, we're going to be talking about the hazardous waste generation classifications as well as episodic generation. And our program today is brought to you by these many organizations that you see in front of you, the Printing United Alliance and the Great Lakes Graphics Association, as well as the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, the Wisconsin Green Tier Program, Sustainable Green Printing Partnership, Flexographic Technical Association, and TLMI. And I do want to give a nice shout out and a great thank you to the Great Lakes Graphics Association for hosting our webinar programs. My name is Marcy Kinter, and I will serve as your moderator today. I am the Vice President of Government and Regulatory Affairs for the Printing United Alliance. And I'm really happy and glad to be here today to be able to share with you this important information. So a bit of logistics before we begin. All attendees are muted, so when you do come in, we do mute you, as well as turn off your video cam to accommodate bandwidth. If you do have a question or a comment, and we will answer all of these at the end of the program, you'll see a chat box in the lower center of the screen. Please go ahead and enter your question in at any time. We do have others with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources monitoring the chat so that if they can answer your question while you're putting it in, they'll be able to do so. And we are recording, and we will be sending out an email that will also send you a copy of the slides and also let you know where you can view the recording later or share with your colleagues. So as we have seen, this is a 6-part series, and we are on part 3. We've already talked about our introduction common violations and looked last time at waste determination and land disposal restrictions. Today, as I indicated, we're going to be focusing on the generator status and episodic generation. And all of this is reflected in the changes that the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources has made within their hazardous waste regulatory structure. And there are 3 additional programs coming up. And we encourage you to check out and to reserve your spot by going to the Great Lakes Graphics Association, their event tab, and they're all listed there. So today we're going to be talking and looking specifically at your generator classifications. Our speakers will be going through each of those classifications and also looking at how do you count your hazardous waste? What is a hazardous, we've talked about what is a hazardous waste. Now we're looking at how do you count it to determine your generator classification. We're going to take a look at the requirements of each of the generator categories and then also talk about episodic generation. So we're joined today by 2 very familiar speakers as they were addressing our session last time in December. Gary Jones, our Director of Environmental Health and Safety Affairs for the Printing United Alliance. Welcome, Gary. So glad you're back with us.
Oh, thank you, Marcy.
And Mike Ellenbecker, who is our Hazardous Waste Program Coordinator for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. And I find it interesting that Mike is responsible, among other things, for developing guidance and policy on hazardous waste issues. And so, Mike, we're really glad you're here to share with us today.
Well, thanks for having me back.
So, Gary, we're going to start with you, and it's all yours. Take it away.
Oh, well, thank you, Marcy. And as Marcy mentioned, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And this is the 3rd of our 6 series, and I'm excited about today's program. Mike and I have worked on it pretty hard, and we've got a lot of ground to cover, and we're gonna jump right into it. So my section is I'm gonna cover the classification, the definitions of what is a generator's classification under the regulatory requirements. Really, how to count. So we're gonna cover how to count hazardous waste or what to count towards my generator classification, and then through the very small quantity generator requirements, and Michael talk to us about the large quantity and episodic generation, which is actually, I think, to me, one of the most significant changes in the regulations that the DNR has adopted. And it was driven by changes by EPA it gives us, in our, at least from my perspective, from the printing manufacturing side, a lot of flexibility with respect to maintaining your generator classification. It'll make sense once Mike goes through that with us. So next slide, please, Marcy. Okay, so, as we talked about in our previous two sessions, in the session Mike and I did in session 2, we talked about, the definition of what constitutes a hazardous waste. So the next step that or the next question that we need to ask ourselves is that now we realize we generate a hazardous waste. What's our category? And the question is, well, you might say, well, why is that important? Well, it's important to understand what your generator category is because the requirements that you have to meet as a generator are based on your category or the classification of being a generator. So there's 3 classifications. Next slide, please, Marcy. And they fall basically based upon the amount of hazardous waste that you generate per month. So the 3 classifications across the top are very small quantity generator, or VSQG, small quantity generator, or SQG, and then large quantity generator, or LQG. And as I said, as you generate more hazardous waste, the regulatory requirements that you have to follow become more. There's more requirements, and once you're a large quantity generator, you have the most set of requirements you have to follow. And likewise, if you're a very small quantity generator, you have the least amount of requirements to follow. And one thing that I know Marcia and I always recommend to our members is to focus on your hazardous waste generation. Look for ways to reduce the amount of hazardous waste that you're generating, or look to change maybe some of your chemistry so it wouldn't be classified as a hazardous waste, because as you can change your generator category and say you're a small quantity generator and you become a very small quantity generator, the amount of requirements you have to follow are going to be less. So from a regulatory streamlining perspective, from a regulatory burden perspective, you really want to focus on minimizing, reducing, eliminating hazardous waste, because as you move down the categories, there's less requirements you need to meet. Now, let's take a look at what qualifies under each of the categories. Well, the way that the regulations are set up, it's based on weight. And so if you look under the very small quantity generator on the very bottom, basically the regulations start with 100 kilograms. And when we do the math, that turns out to 220 pounds. So what that means is if I generate 220 pounds or less per month, I'm considered a very small quantity generator. And again, this generation is based on a monthly monthly generation requirement. And so because we work primarily in printing with liquids instead of solids, the best way to look at it is I like to look at it from a drum perspective. So basically, to give you a rule of thumb, it's about a half of 55-gallon drum, or about 27 gallons, depending upon the weight of the material that we're generating. That gives you a general way to look at, where I quickly fall relative to the generator categories. If we move over to the small quantity generator, it goes from 100 to 1,000 kilograms, and basically that's 200 to 2,200 pounds per month. And we're looking at, more than a half and somewhere between 4 to 5 drums per month, more on the lines of 4 drums per month, based on the weight of the materials that we typically will generate or collect and send off site for treatment as a hazardous waste. Typically, solvents are the primary hazardous waste that we find in many printing operations, although from the last session we talked about the other types of hazardous waste. And then we move to large quantity generator. A large quantity generator is a facility that generates more than 1,000 kilograms or 2,200 pounds per month. And from a drum perspective, we're looking at 4 to 5 drums, again, depending upon the weight of material. What's interesting is Mike and I were talking about the way that the printing industry is I guess the way to say the demographics is that in the state of Wisconsin, there's a fair amount of large quantity generators that are printing operations are large quantity generators. Generally, most printing operations are going to be small quantity or a very small quantity, but because Wisconsin has a large population of larger printers, there is a higher percent of large quantity generator printers in the state of Wisconsin. Next slide, please, Marcy. So so now that we kind of know where those numbers are, then the next question is, well, how do we count that? What gets counted towards my generator classification, my generator status? Obviously, the first thing we want to look at is the quantity of all hazardous waste that we generate on site. And then that quantity of hazardous waste that's generated each month. Now, again, this is a monthly determination. So when you turn the calendar, you need to look at how much waste I generate on a per month basis. And in some cases, if, say, for example, and this is where episodic generation is going to come into play, we might have a really busy month and we might generate more or twice the amount of waste that we typically generate. And so it's not an average, it's the quantity of hazardous waste that you generate each month. So you have to look at those quantities on a monthly basis. You also need to include your satellite accumulation areas, and that's going to come in the fourth session, but basically satellite accumulation areas are containers that you put at or near the point of generation where you collect waste, and then once those containers are full, you move them to your central accumulation area. So when I do my monthly determination, I have to include not only the material that's in my central accumulation area, but the material I'm collecting on a satellite, in my satellite accumulation area. Ideally, you'd like to keep a waste generation log that you would track each month how much waste is generated, because then it gives you a really good idea where you fall relative to being a very small quantity generator, or small quantity generator, or a large quantity generator. One thing I want to caution is you do not necessarily want to use your manifest to count waste, and we have a slide to talk about the reason why you wouldn't. And also, as we talked about on the last session, you consider waste at the point of generation. The point of generation is the point at which you determine that material is no longer useful, it becomes a waste, and then you start to put that into your collection container. So the point of generation is important in terms of understanding what is to be counted towards my generator status. Next slide, please, Marcy. As I said, you want to shy away from, and I know a lot of people will default to my manifest or to your manifest, looking at how much hazardous waste that you send off-site. But when you look at counting shipments, understand that you could have a month at which you don't have a shipment of waste, and then you have a month where you might have 3 or 4 drums that you accumulated over a 2-month period and sent them off-site. And if you looked at just the individual shipment, you could actually consider yourself a much larger generator than if you were just looking at how much you're generating on a monthly basis. I hope that makes sense. In other words, the way that the regulations are set up, you can accumulate up to a certain amount, and we'll talk about that in a second here. You can accumulate up to a certain amount of waste before you have to ship it off-site. You also have time limits as to when you ship that waste off-site. So you can have maybe once or twice a year a rather significant shipment of waste that could perhaps be more than, say, 220 pounds or 2,200 pounds, where you would say, oh my goodness, I'm a large quantity generator because I shipped X amount off-site. But in reality, it took you maybe 6 months to accumulate that total amount. And so when you look at it on a monthly basis, you would actually be a small quantity generator. So that's why we really caution folks not to use their shipment data, their manifest data, as a way to determine generator status. You actually need to go back and look at how much hazardous waste do we generate on a monthly basis. Next slide, please, Marcy. Okay, so just as a visual, we want to look at we have two primary areas where waste is accumulated. The first is our satellite accumulation on the right-hand side, that's at or near the point of generation. Then we also have what we call our central accumulation area, and that's going to be either full containers, because once we have a satellite accumulation container full, we have 72 hours to take that container and move it to our central accumulation area. And in some cases, facilities actually accumulate waste in that central accumulation area. So we might have a partial container as well as a full container. So when we do our counting for the month, we need to look at all those areas where hazardous waste is generated and accumulated. Next slide, please, Marcy. Now, solvent recovery units. This is where it gets a little bit tricky in terms of the math. There are, depending upon the size of the printing operation that you're at, you may be using a solvent recovery unit. It makes perfect sense to use a solvent recovery unit because you can extend the life of cleaning solvent. Typically, it's used for cleaning solvents. I don't necessarily see too many solvent stills used for ink and ink solvents, but occasionally you might see that. Generally, the most common use of these are solvent cleaning solvents, where we can recover and reuse that solvent, so we don't have to spend all that money to use that solvent. We can extend the life of it, use it again and again, and we can use a solvent distillation unit. But when it comes to counting hazardous waste, when it comes to solvent distillation, there are some rules that you need to follow. Next slide, please, Marcy. What I've done here, and I'm not going to go through the math with you. You have a slide that you can go through the math. But basically, what this scenario that we have here in front of us is a most common scenario I run across. The key thing in terms of using solvents and a solvent distillation unit, recovery unit, is that you have two scenarios at which the solvent's going to be collected prior to being recovered in the distillation unit. In this particular example, what we're assuming is that solvent, that waste solvent, the dirty solvent, has actually been sitting there accumulating before we recover it. There is in the regulations the opportunity, if you immediately recovered the solvent, the counting is a little bit different. But in this particular example, we're going to assume that solvent had been sitting there waiting to be recovered by the still. In other words, we're going to collect some small volumes till we get a sufficient amount to run a still. And that's a common scenario because the solvent stills don't run continuously. So in this example, we have 10 gallons of waste solvent that we're going to recover. And then through the course of the month, we're going to add some additional virgin solvent to those 10 gallons. And when we walk through the math, basically we end up with a total accumulation of 17.2 gallons. And the reason why we do that is because when we first recover that solvent, we have to count the first 10 gallons completely because it's considered a waste. It wasn't immediately recovered. And then we would add our 2 gallons on a cycle where we would recover the solvent twice through the month. And then we would have the recovery, because we're looking at an 80% recovery of the solvent through the still. Then we would have that amount that we add to it. So our total is going to be 17.2 gallons. And again, this example is there, and if you want to run through the math, you can reach me offline and we can go through the details. But essentially what this means is that while you might say, I have 10 gallons and I'm adding 2 times or basically 4 gallons in addition, how do I end up with 17 gallons of waste? That's because that initial 10 gallons is not recovered immediately. It was sitting there for a while before we ran this still. Next slide, please, Marcy. So what do not count? Well, obviously, I don't want to count products versus waste. Back to our point of generation, which becomes important. Once I determine that material is a waste and it's no longer usable, then it gets counted towards my generator status. But if I have material that I would recover, say from just an example, say perhaps the ink would be considered a hazardous waste based on the type of ink that's being used, and that ink is going to be reused, and I collect that ink and I pull it out of the press, they put it back into the container, I'm going to reuse it. Well, it's not a waste because I don't have to really do anything to the ink. I'm just recovering it out of the press, and I'm going to reuse it at some point in the future. But if I determine I can't use that ink anymore, then it's going to fall into being a waste. So again, important to understand that even though I'm done using an input material, if I can continue to reuse that material without any treatment whatsoever, it's not considered a waste. Excluded materials, and we talked about this in our previous webinar. Wipes and shop towels, for example, if I manage them properly, they're excluded. They're not considered a waste or even a hazardous waste. Materials that I discharge to the sewer, again, and the key thing here is with permission. So in some instances for commercial printing, if I have a computer to plate chemistry and I do neutralization because I'm allowed to neutralize that material, and if the sewer authority is willing to accept that discharge, it's not considered towards my generator status, even though the pH could be greater than 12.5. Universal waste, and this is the beauty of the universal waste requirements, which we talked about in our last session. If I have a universal waste, if I was throwing it away, it would be considered a hazardous waste. However, if I recycle that material, it falls into the universal waste category, and all universal waste, even though technically they're a hazardous waste, if I'm sending it off-site for recycling, they don't count towards my generator status. Of course, used oil, used antifreeze that's recycled doesn't count towards our generator status. other excluded or exempt materials, and of course, recycled materials that are immediately managed. Again, that's the key. That's why I spent some time on that example with the solvent distillation unit, because again, if I immediately recycle that solvent, it's not considered a hazardous waste. What counted is the sludge that comes out of that still, and that material gets put back into reuse. But if that material is sitting there for a while, before I recover it, then the whole volume gets counted towards my generator status. I hope that's clear. As I said, if you have questions, we can certainly go through and provide some more explanation. Next slide, please, Marcy. Okay, so that we've done a run through of the materials I need to count, materials I don't need to count. Then what we need to worry about is, what do I have to do? So if I go through the process and I look at the amount that I generate per month and I determine that I'm a very small quantity generator, as I said, you have the least amount of requirements. And as a quick reminder, it's basically about a half of a 55-gallon drum. I need to determine, obviously, the amount that I generate per month. Clearly, that's important for all generators. I need to accumulate and label the waste according to the requirements. So we're going to cover that in our next session in terms of proper labeling. But as a quick insight, basically, as a minimum, I need to be putting a label on that container that says hazardous waste. I also need to be able to put on that a description of what's in that container. We'll go through more details in the next session, but I need to give an indication of what is actually in there. So not only does it need to say hazardous waste, but it needs to say like waste solvent, or you could put the waste code on there, but you need to put some additional information. The containers must be in good condition. They must be kept closed at all times unless I'm putting waste in or removing waste from the container. I need to make sure that they're properly disposed. I do, and this is interesting, is that technically I don't need a manifest. And a manifest is basically, again, think of it as the paperwork that accompanies a hazardous waste shipment. It's basically a chain of custody document that shows that the waste was picked up at your facility, was picked up by the hauler, it was then taken to a disposal site. The disposal site signs off on the manifest. They send you back a copy. And technically, you don't, as a very small quantity generator, you don't need a manifest. Now, sometimes it's very difficult to get waste haulers to take materials without a manifest. And in most instances, I find that our very small quantity generator members do need to complete a manifest. But you can use other paperwork too as well. But typically, waste haulers will want to see a manifest because of the way that they're set up to handle the shipments of waste. And here's another one. You can use your own vehicle to transport the waste for proper disposal. Most facilities don't take advantage of that. And in some cases, you can participate in a local collection program. So if you have a local neighborhood collection program, I know this is very common in certain states where they'll accept very small quantities of hazardous waste, and then you can take them, drop them off, make sure you document that those were picked up in the amount and the type of waste, and you have some type of receipt. You can actually participate in those programs. If you have an uncontrollable spill, you need to report to the local authorities, the state authorities, and I see the National Response Center number is covered up by the graphic here. And then most importantly, you can't accumulate more than 2,200 pounds total. So if you're a very small quantity generator, you cannot accumulate more than approximately 4 drums of hazardous waste, because then if you do, that puts you into the next higher category of the small quantity generator. Next slide, please, Marcy. Okay, small quantity generator, similar as the very small quantity. Basically, I need to determine the amount I've generated. So not only do I need to use a manifest is mandatory, but I also must obtain an EPA identification number. And basically, the EPA ID number is a site-specific number. You use a form 8700-12, to obtain that, as well as to update for changes in the types of waste that you would generate. So as a small quantity generator, now I need to get an ID number. And typically, that ID number is issued through the state program. So you would submit the form to the state. And then Mike might be able to comment, in a lot of states we're seeing now are going electronic, where they now want that form submitted electronically. Instead of filling out the paper copy and mailing it in, they'll want that form to be submitted electronically. Again, I need to accumulate and label my waste according to the requirements. And now I need to do something in addition. I need to conduct weekly inspections of my accumulation area. So now I have a requirement in addition to get an ID number. I need to make sure that the material that I'm storing for removal from my facility is actually being stored in properly. I'm checking for damages. I'm checking for leaks and spills, making sure that the material is properly labeled. I have right spacing. If I have a lot of drums, I need to have spacing between the drums. Make sure my incompatible wastes are separated from each other. So, and ideally, when you do the inspection, you are required to maintain a log and also indicate whether or not that you saw any issues or any concerns, and any corrective actions that were taken should be recorded on the log. Next slide, please, Marcy. Now I have a requirement to not to exceed more than 6,000 kilograms, or basically 13,200 pounds in any 180-day period. So now not only do I have a little bit higher limit, but now I have a time limit. If you notice, for the very small quantity generator, you just had an amount limit, not a time limit. But as a small quantity generator, you have to now ship that material off within 180 days from the point at which you start to accumulate that. And this is where it becomes important in terms of labeling your containers with dates. So satellite accumulation is a volume limit. Once I move that to my central accumulation area, I need to date that label, and my time clock starts in terms of getting that material off site. I'm allowed a little bit more time if my shipment travels over 200 miles. But basically, the good way to look at it is 180 days. That waste has to be off-site, even if that container is not full. It doesn't matter once it gets in my central accumulation area and I start accumulating that waste. If the container is not full, once I put the first drop in that container, I need to date the label, and off it goes 180 days. Again, we need to use a manifest, and I also need to provide a land disposal restriction form for each of the hazardous waste streams. So again, you see I've got more requirements. And the last thing is a file and exception report. So basically, when your waste goes off to the disposal site, the hauler takes it, disposal site signs off, you're to receive what's called the return copy back to you. And if you don't receive that return copy within 60 days, you need to file an exception report and let the state know that that you did not get the proper paperwork back, and an investigation will occur. Next slide, please, Marcy. I need to appoint an emergency coordinator. I need to contact local emergency response authorities to let them know that I exist, let them know what types of waste I generate, where that waste is generated, and I need to make sure I document that. One of the changes in the regulations, I need to make sure that I've got some form of documentation. I either sent them an email, a letter, they came and visited, etc. So I need to make sure that I'm reaching out to my local emergency response authorities so they understand the nature and types of waste that I have. And then I need to post next to my telephone, which I know they're starting to become less common, but if you have a telephone, you need to have emergency contact numbers. So you need the name and number of emergency coordinator and the fire department, location of fire extinguishers, spill control materials, and fire alarms. And we're in my central accumulation area. I need to make sure that I have those fire extinguishers and spill control material and some type of access to an alarm system as well. Next slide, please, Marcy. Emergency coordinator, just a quick word. Emergency coordinator should be trained to provide spill containment. Again, depending upon the nature of the amount of material you have, OSHA now becomes involved, whether it's a HAZWOPER requirement, hazardous waste operations, or even HAZCOM. Basically, the rule of thumb is OSHA says if the spill or release can be cleaned up with the people in the immediate area, then training under hazard communication is sufficient. If that spill or release is much greater quantity, then I need to go in to have formal training under the HAZWOPER program, and I think Mike has a slide on that, which we can touch upon. The emergency coordinator needs to respond within a short time frame, 15 to 30 minutes. Typically, in the smaller operations, it's going to be someone of higher responsibility. It could even be the owner of the company that's going to be the coordinator. You need to be thoroughly familiar with the facility, the process, the layout, the hazards, where the material is stored, and then coordinate with any outside emergency notification in case there is a spill or release. You need to contact, again, the National Response Center, the local and state folks, to let them know you had a spill or release and that a response needs to occur because of that. And of course, track all the related info. You need to keep information on dates, times, releases, injuries, volumes, because there will be a follow-up report. Next slide, please, Marcy. Again, the last slide we have is provide general awareness training, proper waste handling an emergency response, develop an informal waste minimization plan, and controllable spills need to be reported, and then maintain records. I think I may have one more slide on records. Next slide, please, Marcy. My records, I need my hazardous waste determinations. As we talked about in the last session, I need to know for sure my waste streams, are they hazardous or not? I need to have a copy of my 8700-12 form and any submissions or resubmissions in terms of updating the types of waste that I generate. State of Wisconsin requires an annual hazardous waste report, which we covered in the next session, so I need a copy of my hazardous waste report. I need my accumulation area weekly inspection logs. I need my ship papers, basically 2 copies of the manifest, and as well as my land disposal form for each waste stream. Any contacts I've had with emergency responders to coordinate any efforts, I need to have documentation, employee training records, because any employee that's involved in working with hazardous waste needs to receive, what's called general awareness training. What is a hazardous waste? How do we accumulate it? Make sure that the containers are closed. Make sure the containers are labeled. Incompatible materials, keep them separate, things like that. If I have any exception reports, and then if I have any spill response records, I need to have all those records available because when the inspector comes in, they're going to be asking you for the records to demonstrate that you're meeting these requirements. All right, next slide, Marcy, and I think that takes us to Mike.
It does.
There we go.
Yeah, so thank you, Gary, for all that information. And I want to encourage everyone who's listening today to please go ahead and enter your questions into the chat box so that at the end of the presentations, we have time for some questions and discussion. So with that, Mike, I'm turning it over to you.
All right, thank you, Marcy. You can go on to the next slide, I guess. So as most of you know, I think that on September 1st of 2020, Wisconsin passed some new rules and updated rules. And one of the nice pieces that we were able to promulgate was the episodic provision. And the episodic provision allows a VSQG or an SQG generator to maintain their existing generator category, provided they follow the episodic requirements. And for the episodic event, there's basically 2 types. There's planned and unplanned. And examples of planned events include periodical maintenance, such as tank cleanouts, but it would not include an increase in hazardous waste due to production. And then unplanned events, production upsets, spills, acts of natures. Next slide, please, Marcy. This slide basically kind of describes what Gary was talking about earlier about what you generate in a calendar month. When we determine a generator's category, you do not average it over a year or 6 months. It's what's actually generated in that calendar month. So you can see in February, it looks like this generator went over by 10 pounds. And then in June, they went up to 300 pounds. So in those 2 instances, that generator would need to follow the SQG requirements if they were not eligible for an episodic event. Next slide, please, Marcy. So as we stated earlier, the episodic generation is available to VSQGs and SQGs. LQGs do not need it because they can generate as much waste as they want because they are at the top of the category. They're the top dog. They can maintain their existing category provided they comply with the episodic generation requirements. And a VSQG or an SQG can have up to 2 events in a calendar year. If the first event is planned, then the second event must be unplanned, and vice versa. If the first event is unplanned, then the second event is planned. For that second event to occur, they must petition the department for that second event. For the episodic generation, basically you have 60 days to conclude the episodic event. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what are some of these requirements? One is VSQGs may or may not have an EPID number, but if they do have an episodic event, they do need to get an EPID number. The episodic hazardous waste must be accumulated in containers or tanks. It can't go on drip pads or containment buildings. And while they're managing the hazardous waste on site, it must be managed in a way that minimizes the possibilities of fires and explosions. For container requirements, the container must be marked with the words episodic hazardous waste. In addition, you need to identify the hazards of the waste. So if you're dealing with a flammable waste, you need to put maybe a flammable placard on that drum, or write the word flammable on that container. You also must put the date upon which the episodic event began, and it needs to be visible in each container. Of course, the container needs to be in good condition, and the waste must be compatible with the container. And you must keep that container closed except when adding or removing waste. You may put a safety device on the container if doing so would avoid an unsafe condition. You can also store episodic waste in tanks. Again, the tank would need to be labeled with the words episodic hazardous waste. You need to indicate the hazards of the tank. For tanks, you can either put the date on the tank, or you can put the date on a logbook or some other type of documentation. And you need to keep the inventory logs for the tank on site. Again, the tank must be leak-proof and in good overall condition, and must be lined with materials that cause a reaction with the waste being stored in it. You need to take precautions to prevent overflow, and you need to inspect the tank at least each operating day. In addition, the generator needs to manifest the hazardous waste. So as a VSQG, you have the option of manifesting waste off-site. But if you have an episodic event, then you must manifest the hazardous waste off-site, which is one of the reasons why you need to have an EPID number, because an EPID number is one of the required pieces of information on a manifest. And then, as we talked about earlier, you have 60 days to get the hazardous waste off-site from the start of the episodic event. Next slide, please. Record keeping. So there are some record keepings. These records need to be retained for 3 years. So you need to have the beginning and end dates of the episodic event, a description of the episodic event, the types and quantities of hazardous waste generated during the event, description of how the hazardous waste was managed, as well as the name of the TSD facility that is receiving the hazardous waste, the names of the hazardous waste transporters, and if you petition for a second episodic event, you need to have a copy of the department's approval letter. Next slide, please. This is an example of an 8700-12 notification form where you're declaring an episodic event. So you can see there's an unplanned and unplanned, and it gives you different types of things you can check to determine what type of activity. It talks about emergency contact, and then towards the bottom it talks about waste description and the waste codes. So all that needs to be filled out and submitted to the department. Next slide, please. So large quantity generators. As Gary said, there's 3 generation categories: VSQGs, very small quantity generators; SQGs, small quantity generators; and large quantity generators. As you go up in the generator category, more rules apply to you. A little bit of a fun fact, I guess. So VSQGs, if you were to consider all the requirements that VSQGs have to follow, including the VSQG requirements themselves, the episodic provisions, sending waste to an LQG under the same counterpart, the universal waste requirements, and the used oil requirements, there are about 195 compliance points that a VSQG would be subject to. For an SQG, there's about 366 compliance points that they would be subject to. And finally, for an LQG, there's over 1,200 compliance points that would be subject to. And a good part of these compliance issues or compliance points requirements deals with what we call record air requirements. And record air is broken down into 3 parts. Subpart A is basically process vents from distillation columns and fraction units, thin film evaporators, solvent extractors, and strippers. And it's where they have an average annual total organic concentration of greater than or equal to 10 part per million by weight, it would be very, very unusual to have an LQG subject to subpart A or subchapter AA. Subpart BB basically is for equipment such as pumps and valves and compressors, open-ended lines, and it's for hazardous waste that are equal to or greater than 10% by weight total organics. And then finally, subpart C or subchapter CC deals with the air emission controls for tanks and containers, and also miscellaneous units and surface impoundments. And that is if you have an average organic concentration of greater than or equal to 500 part per million by weight. With the passage of the rules on September 1st, another nice thing that came out was that you can now petition the local fire control authority for a variance from the 50 feet requirement that isn't within the administrative rule in NR 600. And then for manifest, if you do not receive a copy of the manifest back within 35 days from the TSD facility, you need to contact them. And then if you don't have anything back within 45 days, you need to file an exception report with the department within 4 or 5 days. It is still your responsibility to follow up on it. If you hear nothing from the TSD, facility, it's likely the department would take a look at it and see what is going on. Next slide, please. So some of the other LQG requirements is to have a waste minimization plan. When you sign a manifest, there is a statement that states the following: I am a large quantity generator. I have a program in place to reduce the volume and toxicity of waste generated to the degree I have determined to be economical, practical, and I have selected and the practical methods of treatment, storage, or disposal currently available to me, which minimizes the presence and future threat of human health and the environment. So you're signing a statement when you sign that manifest that you have a waste minimization plan. There's no specific requirements for a waste minimization plan, but kind of the best management practice would be sure to have top management support to characterize the characterization of the waste generation and the management costs for that waste, a periodical waste minimization assessment, cost allocation, technology transfer, and program implementation and evaluation. That should all be part of your waste minimization plan. As a large quantity generator, as an SQG generator, you are required to file an annual report to the department by March 1st of every year. That report should be going out the end of the month of this January or the very first part of February. And when you file the annual report, that will satisfy the 2-year re-notification requirement. Another requirement that came out is that your central accumulation area for containers, they must be closed when you stop that CAA area. And we'll talk about more of that in a little bit. If you have a spill, you need to contact a national response center using the 24-hour toll-free number, 800-424-8802. And you also must maintain records, and we'll talk about that towards the end of the LQG talk. Next slide, please. So this is the LQG notification form that's part of the 8700-12. So a large quantity generator, if they have a central accumulation area or a tank, when that unit is no longer used, they must go through what we call closure. And closure can be one of two options. One, you can place a notice in the operating record, which is your facility files, within 30 days after closing the central accumulation area or tank. And then when you close the facility or at a later point, you can meet the closure performance standards. Another way to do it is notify the department no later than 90 days after closing the unit. The large quantity generator should have met the closure performance standards on or before the date they submitted that 90-day notification. If a large quantity generator needs longer than 90 days to comply with the closure performance standards, then they must submit an extension to the department no later than 75 days after closure. We should have a guidance document talking about closure coming out in the coming months that not only talks about the regulatory requirements, but kind of the best management practices on how to achieve that. Next slide, please. So as a large quantity generator, you have two new things to comply with. You need to develop a contingency plan, and you must have a formalized training program. Next slide, please. So the contingency plan is something that is designed to minimize the hazards to human health and the environment from any fires, explosions, or any unplanned or sudden release or unsudden release of hazardous waste or constituents to air, soil, or surface waters. The provisions of the contingency plan need to be carried out immediately when something like this occurs. And the contingency plan basically contains the actions the facility personnel will take when this occurs. The contingency plan includes a description of the arrangements with the local police department, fire department, and other emergency response teams. In the contingency plan, you will find a list of the emergency coordinators and their telephone numbers, and this list must be kept up to date. And if you have more than one person listed as emergency coordinator, then you need to identify the primary emergency coordinator, and then the other emergency coordinators are listed in the order that they will assume responsibility. The contingency plan must include a list of all the equipment at the facility that will be used in emergency. This will be things like fire extinguishers, spill control equipment, communication alarm systems, decontamination equipment like eye wash stations and safety showers. The contingency plan list must be kept up to date like emergency coordinator. And the list needs to include the location, the physical description, and a brief outline of the equipment's capability. The contingency plan also includes an evacuation plan that will be used. And the contingency plan must be kept by the generator, and any revisions to the contingency plan must be kept by the generator. And the contingency plan and the revisions must be submitted to the local emergency responders. And next slide, please. One of the requirements that came out in the generator rule is to have a quick reference guide. Some of these contingency plans can be quite thick, maybe 50, 60, 70, 80 pages. And that contingency plan is of little value to the emergency response people when they have to dig through all that information. So the quick reference guide is basically a couple pages identifying the very important information to that facility. And the required information is you need to have the types and names of the hazardous waste and the associated hazards, the max amounts where the hazardous waste are stored at the site, if this waste requires any special or unique treatment, maps showing where it's located, identification of the on-site notification system, and the name of the emergency coordinator. So that's all part of that quick reference guide. The quick reference guide, you need to develop a quick reference guide when you start a contingency plan or when you update a contingency plan. So if you are updating your emergency coordinators, then you'll need to develop a quick reference guide. Next slide, please.
There is a visitor at the main entrance.
LQG training requirements. So all facility personnel, including staff and on-site contractors, must be trained on emergency procedures. This is based on the type of hazardous waste management and the facility's generator status. This could include training of facility-specific contingency plan and evacuation procedures. So if you have a contractor coming on site, at a minimum, they should know how to evacuate the site based on the alarm system and where to go to for the rally point. Your hazardous waste training program must teach hazardous waste management procedures relevant to the positions and duties of that employee. Ideally, your training program would present real-world scenarios, and site-specific hazardous waste management activities, which instruct employees how to identify the physical and chemical hazards of the waste, how to maintain records, how to characterize the waste, how to properly label containers, and how to employees are protected from hazardous waste in responses to emergencies. It is the facility owner and operator that is responsible for determining which training methods are the most effective in ensuring hazardous waste training requirements are met. One option is to send the supervisor personnel to a formal off-site training program to acquire the appropriate skills, and then have that person teach those skills to the employees that are on site. Next slide, please. So facility personnel must successfully complete a program of classroom instructions or on-the-job training that teaches them to perform their duties and to ensure the facility's compliance with the training requirements. This training program must be directed by a person that has been trained in the hazardous waste management procedures. It must include position-specific hazardous waste management procedures and training, including contingency plan implementation. Employees may not work in unsupervised positions until they completed the training requirements relevant to their job position. And they must complete this training within 6 months of their employment or assignment to a specific job duty. And they must take part of an annual review of initial training. And we talk about annual review of the training. It must occur at least once during the calendar year. So you could have 18 months elapsed between training periods and still meet the annual training requirement. But we do encourage that the training be close to that 12-month period as possible. Next slide, please. So this is an example of a training matrix. It basically identifies the training elements, such as satellite accumulation, hazardous waste regulations, inspections, making waste determinations. And then it identifies the job category, the environmental manager, the clerk, the program, production supervisor. And then you just fill in and see, well, this is what this person needs to do their job, what type of training. So you may find that training matrix, you may find it helpful to develop a training matrix for your staff. Next slide, please. So for emergency response, again, when you have a spill leak, you must take the appropriate actions. And this is what your training does and what your emergency coordinators should carry out. Next slide, please. So HAZWOPER training is an OSHA requirement, not a RECA requirement or hazardous waste requirement. So what does HAZWOPER mean? It means hazardous waste operations and emergency procedures. So under OSHA, each employer is responsible for the safety and health of its workers and for providing a safe and helpful workplace. Employers must protect workers from anticipated hazards associated with participation in response and recovery operations of hazardous substance. So OSHA, the HAZWOPER, was designed to reduce the risk associated with hazardous material exposures for cleanup and so forth. Next slide, please. So record keeping is basically all the requirements that SQGs have. You need to keep records of your waste determinations, your LDRs. You need to keep a copy of your contingency plan and revisions on site, and report your employee training records. There are specific requirements for that. Your exception reports, closure notification, those are all records that the generator needs to retain. And next slide, please. So we talked about time limits. So SQGs basically have 180 days to get the hazardous waste off-site, and LQGs have 90 days to get that waste off-site. However, if something unforeseen happens, like transport delays, TSD won't take the shipment, you got a labor strike, COVID-19 causes problems, the department can grant a 30-day extension to that 90-day or 100-day period. But you need to contact the department prior to the expiration of the time limit and need to explain why that is needed. And then the department will make a determination if it's available for an extension. One thing I want to follow up on when Gary is talking about wipes, just want to make it clear that they are not counted provided all the conditions for that exclusion are followed. So if you don't follow all those conditions exclusion, then those wipes are treated as regular hazardous waste and will be counted towards your generator status. And Marcy, I think, oh, next slide, please. So the following 4 or 5 slide is basically a matrix showing the requirements on the left-hand side, and then whether that requirement applies to the VSQG, SQG, or LQG. And within that matrix, it will direct you to the specific code citation of where you will find that specific requirement. Next slide, please. And then you can just kind of go through the next couple slides, Marcy, until we get to the Q&A. And I believe that's all that I have, Marcy.
Great. Well, thank you. Wow, a lot of ground to cover. My goodness. So I do have to say, I actually have a question because I, like Gary, really feel that the whole concept of the episodic generation was just a marvelous addition to the regulations, because we do have quite a few of our printers that would be considered small quantity or even very small quantity generators that might have an unplanned, or they may want to empty out their ink inventory, and it always was an issue. So the question that I have is, if you are a very small quantity generator or a small quantity generator and you do have an episodic event, either planned or unplanned, you need to complete an annual report on that?
I can get down, Marcy. No, you would not. That's one of the nice things about having the episodic provisions is you're not subject to the VSQG or SQG requirements, and therefore not subject to the annual reporting requirements.
Oh, excellent. I do have to reiterate, I was just very excited, as Gary was, when that was included in both the federal update and then when the Wisconsin DNR accepted that as a change. So, Joe, do we have any questions from the audience?
Absolutely.
Marcy, let me jump in and ask a follow-up question of Mike. Oh, just so we're clear, if you do have an episodic event, though, you still have to report that, correct? In other words, you still have to file the 8712 form. Okay.
Yeah, you have to notify via the 8700. Excuse me, the 8700-12 form. And one thing to note, and we probably get maybe on average 1 or 2 a week on these episodic events. If a generator has a planned event, and if they're notifying 25 days before the planned event, we'll deny it because the code requires it to be 30 days. So you got to make sure you follow that 30-day or within 72 hours. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to grant that episodic event.
Okay, great to know. And Joe, you said we had quite a few questions.
Yes. What are generators' requirements for making arrangements with local emergency responders? This one's for Mike.
One, they need to reach out to the fire department, police department, and make sure that they are going to respond. And that can be documented in the contingency plan. So, and the other part is, if they cannot respond, then as part of the new generator requirements, that also needs to be documented in the contingency plan.
Now, is that for all generator categories, for VS?
Just for the LQGs, just for the contingency plan.
Okay, great, thank you.
And Mike, what about for the SQGs? Because that's a new requirement that in terms of, yeah. Sorry.
You know, I would have to double check specifics on that, Karen, because I do not know offhand.
Okay.
But yeah, but for the LQG, the new regulations added a requirement that the generator must keep documentation of the fact that it has made arrangements within local emergency responders.
Here's
Yeah. So, but I'd have to check the SQGs, but I do not know the answer offhand right away.
Do SQGs have an episodic event need to complete an annual report? I don't know if this has been asked yet.
Yes, because SQGs are already required to file an annual report, just being an SQG.
Do the LQG closure requirements apply to satellite accumulation areas?
No, the LQG closure requirements only apply to like a central accumulation area where you got your containers, or like or for tanks.
I have another one. For RCRA air requirements, what are the common violations seen at printing operations?
One for record would be basically for Part B or Subchapter BB is failure to label the equipment, failure to identify the equipment that is subject to Subchapter BB. And the other one is Subchapter C is when you got a tank. Some printers have been managing the tank that contains the waste solvent as not a hazardous waste tank, which is incorrect. It is a hazardous waste tank. And so they're not following the tank requirements in Subchapter J of Chapter 665 and not following the air emission standards in Subchapter CC in 665. And these are usually on your LQG printers. Actually, the record air requirements only apply to LQGs.
Excellent. Well, that's all the questions that I have on the chat.
okay.
Are there any others?
Last call for questions while we go through. So I did put up Mike and Gary's contact information. So please feel free to reach out to either Mike or Gary if you have an issue or a question that you would like to address and chat with them about. So thank you both for the in-depth information and conversation. I do know that it's quite a bit to condense all this information into an hour presentation on these changes that we've been so fortunate to have within the regulatory structure. And we do have 3 more sessions in this series. So please, again, go to Great Lakes Graphics Association's website, look under events and register for these programs. We're going to be talking about the management, transport, and reporting. We're going to take a look at inspections and record keeping. And then our final one, we'll talk about tanks, exemptions, and hazardous secondary materials. I know you all are just impressed that I actually know what HSM stands for. So, so with that, are there any more questions, Joe?
No.
Okay, so thank you once again for everyone participating. And again, if you have anything that you would like to reach out, you can reach out to GLGA, to Gary, or to Mike. So thank you all for listening today, and we look forward to seeing you on January 26th.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.